1934. The country has been living through hard times for 5 years now. And even at $1.50, tickets for pro hockey games are too much for most fans. The National Hockey League is fighting for its life. Some teams are sold, others fold. Of the 10 teams that made up the NHL in the late 20s, only 6 will survive the Depression. The Ottawa Senators, 7-time winners of the Stanley Cup, will not.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, friends, how are you? It's another episode into the realm of ice hockey, and we've had a couple of interesting episodes in weeks and months past around a number of more modern NHL franchises, and certainly the WHA has gotten a fair treatment here on this little show, and many more of those to come in the weeks and months to follow. But we're going to go back into the earliest, let's call it primordial ooze of the National Hockey League, which is also an amazing and interesting time and era. And yes, there were teams that were not just the original 6. I think a lot of people kind of look back and frankly don't recognize they think that the history of the NHL was just the original 6 until 1967 and the Great Expansion. But alas, no, the answer is not that. There were a bunch of teams in a very fledgling late 19-teens and early 1920s that sort of begot or morphed into, that's the better term, I guess, into what is now known as the National Hockey League. And there are teams like the Montreal Wanderers and the Toronto Arenas, the New York Americans, a very interesting franchise, the Montreal Maroons, very competitive team to the Montreal Canadiens. Heck, even the Philadelphia Quakers for a season. All bunches of teams that were part of the original hard scrabble and undetermined parts of what then gelled into the original 6, or was called the original 6, in the NHL. I think people think the original 6 means literally the original, and it is not the case. And that is the topic of our conversation this week with our guest, Andrew Ross. He, the author of Joining the Clubs, The Business of the National Hockey League to 1945. And we're going to be talking about some of those early times, early years, the formative years of what is now the National Hockey League, and how sort of the business of professional hockey kind of got going, got started, got congealed into the modern era, shall we say. And as you can hear in our conversation with Andrew, this is frankly the beginning of perhaps a 2, maybe even 3-part story of how the history and the economic history of professional hockey, especially the NHL in this country and in Canada, of course, sort of became the standard that we know it today. A very interesting conversation, and arguably the beginning of perhaps a few others to come with Andrew Ross. He, the author of Joining the Clubs, in just a couple of seconds. I want to remind you that we've got we got a bunch of tremendous sponsors, but 2 in particular I want to call out now. One is oldschoolshirts.com out of Cincinnati, and the promo code GOODSEATS to get 10% off of all of your purchases. At oldschoolshirts.com, you're going to find NHL, you're going to find WHA, you're going to find a bunch of hockey stuff, shirts, and even some of the arenas that some of those teams played in. Lovingly remembered and high-quality T-shirt form. Oldschoolshirts.com. Make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS and get 10% off all of your purchases. We thank P.F. Wilson and his friends at oldschoolshirts.com for sponsoring our little show, and hopefully you'll find a few hockey items that you're going to love and enjoy. And I do think you'll also find a few hockey items that you're going to love and enjoy from said leagues, the NHL, the WHA, etc., even others, some minor leagues and all that kind of stuff at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS there at sportshistorycollectibles.com and get, wait for it, 15% off of all your purchases, courtesy of Dean Mitchell and friends there. Some great hockey stuff there. Hell, there's a really cool beanie hat from Mitchell and Ness of the old Kansas City Scouts that's on there for a really amazing price. I don't know, it was part of somebody's collection. They never used it. It's got the tags and everything on it still. And to me, that's got sort of the glint in my eye. And that's among the dozens of items you're going to find in all kinds of sports and teams and leagues that don't exist anymore or were previously incarnated. And hockey is absolutely a very robust component of such. That's at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And remember, again, use that promo code GOODSEATS at checkout and get 15% off your purchases there at Goods from your friends here at Good Seats, still available. Thank you very much. Our friend Dean Mitchell, the proprietor of such, we thank him and sportshistorycollectibles.com for their sponsorship of our show as well. All right, so we've moved that out of the way. Let's brush it to the side, shall we? And we encourage you to keep an ear for this very interesting conversation. I learned a ton about the economic history of the early days of the National Hockey League. Give a listen. I think you're going to like it.
Where I come from, it is, well, being Canadian, we kind of have hockey in our blood to a certain extent. I, of course, played as a kid. But as I went to school doing history, I became very interested in business history and how businesses in particular kind of used culture, used the appearance of their product in their business model. And what I discovered at sports is very interesting in this respect, in the sense that people don't even see sports really as a business in many ways. And so I thought to myself, well, what are these guys who are running these leagues, in particular hockey, the NHL, what do they think they're doing? Do they think they're sportsmen? Do they think they're businessmen? Are they taking advantage of this perception, or are they just out to make money, or they really want a Stanley Cup? So I really wanted to look at the inside of the kind of inside the mind of the hockey businessman of the early part of the century to see what they thought they were up to.
And what and sort of how did this particular sort of laser focus sort of come into play, right? Because the NHL, for example, right, very has a bunch of different sort of, say, eras or parts of its sort of its history. You've kind of focused in on sort of the earliest sort of modeling, I guess, of the NHL and its early days and maybe its not so direct path to the economics that exist today in the league.
Yeah, what I was looking at and what it fascinated me about the early part of the league was that originally hockey in Canada starts at one of the later sports after other big sports like lacrosse, to some extent about the same time as football. And it really looked, in hockey's case, to lacrosse as its model for how to run its league. But as it becomes more commercial, it looks south and it sees the National League and the American League and how they organize things. And there's this moment in 1909 where they basically switch over the rules for running the league from a lacrosse model to an American baseball model. And baseball is really the model that they use from then on about how to organize your players. They essentially have their own version of the reserve clause. They have, restrictions about who can get into the league, and they keep it as this, essentially this cartel, which is the model that the baseball had been using. And then at football and in the 20s, the NFL, and then later basketball also adopts. So you get these big four leagues that essentially use all the same model.
Yeah, so let's talk about that model because we've definitely touched on some of the I don't know, shall we say either well thought out or at least beginning ideas of what the business of these leagues and these teams might be, right? So one of the things that we go back to is, we certainly talk about, the teams and the play and the excitement and the interest and the fan fervor for the sport and professionalized. But even in the earliest days, and we go back into the late 1800s with baseballs in the United States, we still hear this sort of term of he, or generally he, occasionally a she, was a businessman. Yeah. Right? It's always sort of they're always trying to figure out dollars in this sort of professionalism. And in this era when the NHL was sort of, rattling around as an idea, right? Were there competing models or thoughts in this, or was it just let's get an assemblage of players in a league and then we'll figure out the business model as we go along?
Yeah, so the big competing models early on, this is true for baseball and hockey, is the competition between the amateur model and the professional model. And basically the difference although there's a moral dimension where people say, you're better off to be playing a sport for moral elevation rather than profit. It really comes down to these amateur teams start making a lot of money, and it's really a question of whether or not they can start paying their players or not. And so the professional baseball, the difference is whether or not the players really get paid. Once the professionals become more comfortable with being professional and saying, we're legitimate, and hockey takes place in the first decade of the 20th century, the big choice there is between having a cartel league where you have separately owned teams, or a league that is owned all by the same people. And there's an example of this league, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, which is actually owned by a pair of brothers who go out to the West Coast, and they realize they're not going to get entrepreneurs to invest in these teams unless they own all the teams first. This is something that had come out of baseball, where there's some suspicion about this, about owners owning multiple teams. And the reason is quite a simple one, is that if the owner of the teams, two teams had the same owner, you weren't sure that the competition on the field was going to be fair, that maybe the owner would do something to undermine the integrity of the game. So what happens is baseball works this out in the late 19th century and basically says we're going to have separately owned teams. There'll be no cross ownership. Hockey basically makes the same choice. Early on, it decides, like I said, to get into a certain space, it needs to have a little bit of co-ownership, but essentially it weeds that out by the 1950s. So there's no overlap. You'll notice Major League Soccer actually started with that model as well, where they basically had some of the teams being owned by the league, right, or owned by one or single owners. So, but this is not the model that North America has taken. It's a very strong association between the city and one owner, one city, competing off the field and on the field, if you will.
Yeah, so that is a central theme in a lot of conversations that we've had, and a lot of sort of looks back, right? A case in point that I just can think of off the top of my head is in our discussions of the Arena Football League, right, with the founder of it, Jim Foster. The real tension between, he was very concerned about, I guess, the franchise model and the individual ownership thing in the earliest days of what wasn't even a sport, right, per se, right? It was indoor football, and
right.
The rules were different. It was a relatively new and novel kind of thing. The last thing he wanted to do was have owners from various ports of call, shall we say, sources of wealth and whatnot, diverging on thought process, when in his mind it was, we got to get this sport kind of nurtured first before we can even get to that point. And he tells a story later on, in the years later on, that he kind of lost the battle and then to the owners that essentially pushed him in that direction and pushed him out to go that franchise model. And we can make the argument that AFL has never really recovered since. But that idea of centralized ownership, to get things going at the very least, versus a purely franchised, kind of model with some level of regulation and or rules and maybe economics. It's a very interesting tension that I don't think is really, when we talk about new and fledgling leagues, you mentioned MLS. Major League Soccer is still they're owner operators, right? They do have franchises, but they're not, it's a collective still. And, you get into the soccer cognoscense and they'll say, maybe it's time to take those training wheels off and let sort of the free market kind of decide. But, there are reasons why not.
Yeah. And that's what's really fascinating about what we've now seen in North America is this Major League sports model, is that balance between that individual owner and keeping the league together. And that's the reason I call my book Joining the Clubs, because it's about joining, in some sense, a club, a sportsman's club, but it's also about joining the clubs together so they stay together. Right? And in the history of the NHL before 1917 is every 5 to 10 years they would break up. Someone would go off and say, we're stronger than you, we're going to join up another formation. And in the early years of the league, and up into the WHA, right, we had that example of that league splitting off. The tension is always keeping them together. So, and what's the big picture of this, if you back up a step to look at the economy in general, is that business in general in the 20th century in North America was concentrating. You think of a company like General Motors, where it brought together, Chevrolet and, Cadillac and all these different brands, these older companies under one roof. They're getting bigger and they're concentrating. Hockey, sports are actually doing the opposite. They're actually staying local in a national league, right? It's actually a very interesting concept. A few years ago, actually, Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital, actually put a proposal to the NHL to buy the entire league. Because they see the logic here, which is that it's actually much more efficient if you ran marketing entirely out of the NHL central office and you controlled, of course, all the salaries through the central office. There'd be no competition between teams at all, right? And so they actually proposed this, that they essentially buy the entire league. And I think they were offering a little bit less than Gary Bettman and the owners wanted, about $2.5 billion. But from the outside, people do see that the logic could be that the league could be owned by essentially one owner or shareholders.
So maybe it's helpful to kind of go back to the let's call it the primordial ooze, I guess, of the NHL, right? So, by the mid-20s, essentially, the NHL had emerged, I guess, out of whatever sort of competition. I mean, you mentioned a couple of leagues, the PCHA and the Western Canada Hockey League, and so others sort of came and went. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of how. I mean, if you look at the sort of the records, I mean, I guess the history books will say the NHL kind of got started in 1917. Maybe there's some debate to that, but maybe you can give us a sense of sort of how the NHL kind of by the mid-20s really became literally, I guess, the only sort of major league hockey proposition in North America. And maybe we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So the early story of hockey is essentially it starts off in sports clubs, essentially in Montreal, right? And it started off with these amateurs, these middle class people who have day jobs and they're playing at night. And then, of course, they start realizing, as with other sports, that people will pay to see this. They will also gamble on the games, and it becomes a little bit more serious in terms of money, and there's money to be made. So there's this competition, as I mentioned earlier, between these amateurs who say, we're going to still play for moral elevation. We don't play for money. And there's other people, these entrepreneurs who don't tend to be of the same class. They're the Irish Canadian, the French Canadian entrepreneurs of Montreal who say, no, there's a few bucks to be made here. And so they essentially make this break in the first decade of the 20th century and say, we're going to be fully professional. And it turns out that's a good model in terms of performance on the ice because they start taking over the Stanley Cup competition. So the Stanley Cup competition essentially becomes dominated by professional teams. So the challenge that the National Hockey League and its predecessor, the National Hockey Association, there's lots of alphabet soup of leagues at this point, is that they really want the teams in the biggest cities. So they started Montreal, Quebec City, in Ottawa, and then they moved down to Toronto. And Toronto's a bastion of amateurism. Everyone loves amateur hockey there. And also the owners love amateur hockey because, as I said before, they don't have to pay the players. And players' costs are becoming a big part of the economics of the game. So the NHL has a really hard time actually getting into Toronto. Now, there's, of course, the context of the First World War here is putting strains on players. And it's really after the war that people really see the opportunity and sport basically starts exploding, particularly in the United States. This is the era of Red Grange and Bill Tilden and all the big stars of Babe Ruth in the 20s. And people have more money now in the 20s. This is the roaring 20s, and they're willing to spend it on leisure activities. And hockey sees that as well. And they see that the future of the league really has to be the United States unless they're willing to have a rival league. So they go to Boston, they go to New York, they go to Pittsburgh, they go to Chicago, they go to Detroit in that decade. And really start establishing themselves as the top elite league. Of course, there's all these other cities that want hockey teams too. So Frank Calder, who's the president, basically comes up with a scheme, again, modeled on baseball, where he will encourage these other smaller cities to affiliate in leagues that are minor leagues, right? Minor to the NHL. And the NHL will take their best players and give them money in return. So he's really trying to control and restructure the hockey industry in that tiered baseball model. And it's, I think, about 1932 is the latest that another league actually has the boldness to challenge for the Stanley Cup and say, we're good enough to be in the Stanley Cup. And Calder figures out a way to basically make sure that doesn't happen. By the time the Depression kicks in, the NHL teams are the only ones that can really survive. And that's essentially sets the model. You've got 7 teams in the Depression. They dropped 1 during the Second World War. And then from then you've got that, what people see as the golden age of the 6 teams in the NHL up until the expansion in 67.
So that's interesting. A couple of things to unpack there. I guess the first one that sort of comes to mind.
Yeah, there's lots.
Yeah. So you're mentioning sort of the parallels or the emulation, I guess, of baseball in that time. One of the things that we've scratched on a couple of times in some conversations around, frankly, some of the earliest days of baseball, late 1800s, early 1900s, is this sort of, I guess you could call it formative tension between professionalism and amateurism, right? So in the late 1800s, right, baseball, the idea of professionally pursuing or putting together a pro sort of circuit for baseball was itself even a controversial at the time conversation, because there was sort of the love of the sport. It was thriving at the amateur level. The potential interloping from things like gambling and other sort of untoward and or feared activities that would sort of come when you put money into the game. And yet a bunch of folks recognizing that without some, level of, let's call it professionalism, but clarity around schedules and some centralized thinking about rules and those kinds of things. Yeah. So maybe
organization.
So it sounds like that hockey was sort of going through some of that as well. Although it seems that maybe professionalism came a little bit more quickly or is a little bit more clear. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. You can kind of see, if you look at each individual sport in that area, you kind of see this progression from amateur to professional and this controversy that comes with it. So essentially the hockey amateur conflict really comes to a head, I think, probably 10 or 20 years after the baseball one. Baseball more or less got it resolved by the early part of the century. We got the formation of, the 2 major leagues together. Hockey also comes after lacrosse. It's interesting that the hockey rules have rules about the initial hockey league rules say basically you can't pay players, but there was no suggestion that anyone actually was being paid at that time. They basically borrowed the rule from lacrosse, where lacrosse had developed earlier and they had started paying players. But this is a really important point here is about the nature of the commercial product itself, is that it's a cultural product in the sense that people play sports to reinforce their community identity, to reinforce their own identity, right? It has this product, which we see now, actually has a cultural and a social meaning that is very strong. And that's why amateurism was so strong before, is because people did not play it for money. They played it to show off, to show their strength, to show their manhood, their manliness. There was different reasons. There were social reasons for playing, to show off their class as well, right? And one of the things about class was that if sport became a symbol of leisure activity, then you had to prove that it wasn't your job, because you had to prove that you had the time and the money to play it after work, not as work, right? So this is all wrapped up in that debate.
Yeah, it almost feels like baseball sort of created a bit of a blueprint. But let me ask you this question, right? So with unlike baseball, right? We had, over the first couple of decades of baseball's professional landscape, you had a number of different leagues settling into what ostensibly became 2 major leagues, occasionally joined by a third. I'm curious as to, I guess this is sort of maybe the other thing to sort of unpack from your previous comment, is how did the NHL sort of, circle the wagons to centralize this kind of control? And interestingly, maybe why another league or 2 kind of didn't rise to the level of the NHL to be a second professional league. Was it because there was just a lack of effort or geography that made sense, or was it maybe the NHL recognizing and then solidifying its grip on the game at this early stage?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on, but I think the central thing I would point to is the importance of the arena itself, which is that unlike baseball, which in theory you carve out a field and you start putting out some bleachers, you can have a game and start developing from there. There's a technology essentially and an infrastructure cost to hockey that basically means cities only really have one arena that's good enough for a hockey game early on. And you see when there's early fights, when the NHL in the early 1920s is worried about rival leagues starting up, it's really about we need to control the arena. And once we control the arena, basically no one else can play in that city, right? Because essentially this is the era of artificial ice up until basically 1910, 1912. Hockey was restricted to Quebec, Ottawa, Montreal, and say Winnipeg, like that, those northern latitude cities that could essentially have outdoor ice for 2 months a year to play the league. It's the jump to Toronto in 1911, 1912 that is basically requires artificial ice, and then you have the jump to the Pacific coast to Vancouver that has to have artificial ice as well. And there it's all about the arena. So if you can control the arena, you can basically control what kind of hockey gets played there. And this is the difference in the WHA in the 1970s, is they start realizing there's a lot more arenas than there are NHL hockey teams, right? So that the WHA can go to a city and say, look, you've got an arena that holds 15,000 people. You have no major league hockey team. We can give you one, right? In 1920, those didn't exist. So that's the big advantage that hockey has over, say, baseball or football, and that the playing field is part of the equation.
That's interesting. And so economically, that's a very interesting lever, right? Because you're literally controlling a scarce asset, right? That essentially prevents, right? So that's interesting. Are there any other, besides the arena, which seems to be a very solid and important lever, are there any other sort of things that the NHL kind of did to kind of exert its, monopolistic tendencies? That's my term, right? About that's exactly what it is, right? I mean, and I did mention the role of Frank Calder, who was the first president of the NHL from 1917 until his death in 1943, as being the person in the late 20s that pushed non-major league cities into not aspiring to the major league. I mean, first of all, we had to accommodate, or the Canadian League had to accommodate American capital. There's a big fight, essentially, in the early 1920s, where Tex Rickard, the legendary Tex Rickard, who controls Madison Square Garden and was really creating, in some sense, the model for the modern sports arena, was looking for something to put into his arena. And he looks at indoor soccer, he looks at all these different sports, and eventually comes to this sport from Montreal, where he realizes, I could get X number of nights during the winter to mix in with my boxing matches. So he goes for that. But as soon as he gets into the sport, that completely changes the economic landscape, because MSG is twice the size. So it means it can make twice the money. This is the era before big broadcasting deals. And they can pay players twice the amount. And Rickard's got this idea that he's going to plant a Madison Square Garden in Boston, which he does. He's also got one for Chicago and Philadelphia, which never come to be. But the NHL realizes it's got to get into that game and basically piggyback on him. So Calder really manages that relatively well. I mean, he often talks about how crazy NHL owners are, but the fact that he survived as president in this era is kind of a tribute to his diplomatic skill. But he's also managing this expansion project where, for a few years, every 6 months, 5 or 6 different cities would apply for teams. And he's managing whether or not they will get those teams or not. And the NHL does expand to 10 teams and then drops back to 7 and then 6 over that era, right? So it wasn't a perfect system. The other thing that they do use, I think, which is important, as I mentioned, was the Stanley Cup. This notion of like the top league having the top trophy, and that being a legitimization of your status, right? Baseball's American League and National League had kind of agreed that they would be equal in status and to play the World Series for the champion. The NHL never really allowed that to happen. They, after 26, that was basically the last championship between the NHL, Stanley Cup championship between the NHL and the another league. And after that, the NHL basically holds onto that Stanley Cup, right? So even today, I mean, in theory, a rival league could pop up and say, we're good enough to play for the Stanley Cup and apply for it. But we know, of course, the NHL has basically taken over that competition, and that people probably wouldn't accept that would happen. Well, so how did the NHL wrest that iconic trophy from what I guess was fledgling leagues in the National Hockey Association and the Western Canada Hockey League at that time? I mean, it seems to me like getting and somewhat legally or illegally or by
Well,
it almost feels like that's one of these sort of maybe iconic. I don't know. I don't want to say death knells to the other two leagues, but it almost it seems like another monopolistic sort of solidification that NHL is the one that's going to wind up surviving in the years following.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. So what had happened is that once the PCHA had been established again through artificial ice in the teens, they have basically problems maintaining themselves as a league, and they join up with become the Western Canadian Hockey League, and they're trying to make it work across Western Canada. Of course, the cities there aren't as big, which means they aren't making as much money, which means there's a lot of travel costs as well, because there's a vast, train fares are actually a big part of the operational costs of a team at this point. And when the NHL starts expanding in 23-24 to the U.S., and like I said, get into Madison Square Garden, which essentially changes the economic landscape of the NHL, the writing's on the wall for the PCHA. They know they're not going to survive. So essentially their players, the league dissolves or becomes a minor league, and then the star players come to the NHL to feed these new American teams. So at that point, all the expansion is going to be basically in U.S. cities. And so all Calder has to do is essentially control the ambitions of those new leagues in the United States. And the big challenger in the late 20s is a league called the American Hockey Association, which is in Chicago, Minnesota, St. Paul, that area, basically the Midwest. And so they have aspirations to rival the NHL, and that is the last example, as I mentioned, of a league actually saying we want to play the NHL for the Stanley Cup. We want to return to that binary competition between the NHL and some other league. So Calder basically arranges so that won't happen. To be fair, the NHL itself, the Stanley Cup itself, is actually run by two trustees. They're independent, but they of course do live in Montreal and Ottawa. I mean, they're up here in Canada, so they probably were pretty biased towards the NHL. But in theory, they were open to other people applying for it.
Yeah, that's interesting because it almost feels like that Stanley Cup architecture, shall we say, right? Could have easily been sort of the roadmap by which the professional game could have been or was controlled, right? And if there was sort of the, I guess, leaning already towards a favoritism, I guess, to this NHL, right, versus using the Stanley Cup maybe as a collective umbrella for 2, maybe 3 at the time, and for a period of time, competing leagues, right, where, maybe geographically they could be their own sort of professional circuits, keep travel costs low, and the Stanley Cup would be sort of the ultimate unifier in the, grand championship of the sport. But it's interesting, I guess, either through, above board or below board methods, right? I guess the securing of that Stanley Cup, right, iconic as it was. I mean, it basically makes the NHL kind of the major, if not only, professional sort of game in town. What I'm interested in, though, is, as they expand in the 20s and whatnot, right? I mean, it's clear that that there's a central control, I guess, that seems to be pretty dominant, and to the point where there really aren't any sort of major league challengers after sort of this era. And I'm curious as to how would you describe the NHL's defenses and walls, shall we say, in terms of keeping interlopers and challengers sort of at bay during this time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I go back to the arenas, because what starts happening is from about the late 1930s, the NHL always had a rule, which was owners could not own other hockey teams. And what they meant by that was that they didn't want multiple ownership of NHL teams. But it often got interpreted as not owning minor league teams as well. But by the late 1930s, that seems to have been relaxed. And what you have is the Chicago and then the Toronto teams start buying American Hockey League teams. So that's the minor league that still exists and basically started up in this era. And so you start seeing that the NHL owners own parts of teams, and they also, in the post-war, start structuring their player development through those teams, right? So they essentially make those leagues subordinate to them through ownership, through player deals, and also through drafts, right, where they're allowed to draft on those teams and take their star players, right? So that's the system that gets created. And again, this ownership of the arena and being in the top markets is what it's about. Because until they show weakness in the late 60s by not expanding quickly enough, basically the only big places, big enough markets with arenas are essentially ones that the NHL or the AHL are in already. Right, so they basically lock up again that arena infrastructure. Right? It's only until like people start realizing California, is this big market that we've been avoiding that it really starts changing the market, as it does for baseball. Right, baseball is kind of in a similar situation.
So let's talk about sort of the macroeconomic scenario around that time, right? Because obviously the Great Depression certainly touches all facets of life in North America and certainly the globe too. How much does that have a role to play in, consolidating and or centralizing and or, making more, unified this fledgling NHL, small as it might be in I guess, compared to modern terms. Maybe you could sort of put that into context. And it almost feels to me, as an amateur historian, right, it almost solidified the NHL's grip on the sport professionally. Is that a fair assessment, or am I just being naive?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And what it does is it also clarifies the successful model. So the lesson of the 30s, which is, of course, places like Detroit, consumer spending just gets wiped out, and the team basically gets sold. This is how Jim Norris gets into the league because he's still rich and everyone else is poor. And he basically takes over the Detroit team and renames it the Red Wings. And he actually gets his mitts on various parts of arenas, right? So at a certain point, Norris himself or his family have their tentacles either into the arena or the team of 4 different NHL teams. And that lasts into the post-war era. So that essentially Norris, in some sense, his money saves the NHL because some of the teams were in a fairly delicate position. But what they start realizing after the war, there's a lot of optimism, but then the big challenge after the start of the Second World War is, at the come of this period of the Depression and the war, is TV. And TV is a thing that really starts hurting all sports in North America. As people, I think soldiers are coming home, having small children and babies, and realizing they can turn on the TV and have some entertainment rather than going downtown to the ballpark. So that has a big effect on the American teams, less so on the Canadian teams. And this is actually where you see a divergence, where the Canadian teams, at this point, that's only the Montreal Canadiens and Toronto Maple Leafs, they actually start becoming more powerful than the American teams. And what starts happening is Boston is weak, Chicago is very weak, and the league itself starts pressuring teams to join the ownership of the team and the arena. So that was not always the case, that those were the same owners, and that becomes the model going forward, is that you need to own the arena and own the team. Right? And that's a model that essentially they to some extent persists to this day, right? Either that's the NHL's preference, is that you own both of those so they can kind of support each other. And also, what of course does that allow? It allows you to control who comes into your arena, right? So there won't be a rival team coming into Maple Leaf Gardens, because Maple Leaf Gardens is owned by the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? They're not going to allow any kind of rival. They will allow an early Toronto National Basketball Association team, or they'll allow a minor league hockey team, right? They'll allow other sports to create that post-war arena model of, having your NBA team, your NHL team, maybe a minor league team in there as well. But that is another thing that really controls the competition.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break here, and we got to pay some bills, and we want to thank our friends at MyBookie for helping us pay some of those bills. It's football season, friends, and as you know, football is probably the most exciting and most wagerable sports there is, whatever, I'm talking about, and there's no better place to experience some of that wagering fun and good lines and payouts than MyBookie. MyBookie.ag, that's the actual website to go to. And we want to encourage you to give it a try, because if you use the promo code SEATS with your initial deposit, you're going to get matched dollar for dollar up to $1,000 for your initial deposit. That basically means $2,000 for the $1,000 that you put in, if you do the maximum, to use for your betting purposes, right? And you want to bet on any game, National Football League, it's college football, all kinds of other sports, both domestic and international. You can try your luck at betting with MyBookie, mybookie.ag, and you're going to use that promo code SEATS, and you're going to get dollar for dollar matching for your initial deposit, all the way up to $1,000. And there's no lack of excitement now that sports gambling is effectively legalized here in the United States. It's going to be a very interesting experiment. And again, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to bet on any of the games and the teams and the leagues that we talk about on this little show. But let's assume that you don't always live in the past, and you do live in the present, and you've got an inkling, you've got a hunch, you just know that a certain team, hell, even fantasy points and scenarios are bettable at MyBookie. So give that a try. And again, if you're looking at a game you just think you just got an inside track on, MyBookie is the place to go at mybookie.ag. And make sure when you sign up, again, use that promo code SEATS, and they're going to match your initial deposit dollar for dollar up to $1,000. And we encourage you to give them a try and enjoy the extra dollars on us. And good luck as you make your way through the NFL and college football seasons. We wish you the best. MyBookie, that's mybookie.ag, and we thank them for their support of our little show. And of course, we go back to our conversation right now. So knowing the scarcity issue of quality arenas and stuff, so how maybe I'm really curious about sort of how that dynamic plays out in two cities during this time, Montreal and New York, right? Because those are the only two, based on my research, are the only two cities that for a decent period of time supported or had two viable teams in the NHL, right? The Canadiens and the Maroons for a period of time, and then in New York you had the Americans and the Rangers. I'm naive to which arenas that these respective teams were playing in, but maybe a little bit of a sense of that. Were they each in their own arenas, or was there a battle for the same arena for each of these franchises? Because it seems like this would be a really good indication about how solid a grip ownership of an arena would be. So that is actually, that's very much part of the story, and that's the problem that gets resolved essentially in the 30s and the 40s. So what starts out is we'll start with the story in Montreal. Montreal traditionally had many teams at the elite level, up to 4 in the elite hockey league, and this kind of filters out by the time of the NHL starts up into a team that's associated with the French Canadian community in Montreal, the Canadiens, and one that's associated with the English community, which is the Wanderers, and they play in a building called the Montreal Arena. Well, a few weeks into the NHL start, the arena burns down, and the Wanderers basically give up. They suspend operations. So it's only Montreal Canadiens for a while. But there's money, there's capital in the English community, particularly in Montreal, to build a new arena. That becomes the Forum, which opens in the early 20s, and they get a new team to go with that, and the team is the Maroons. They were going to call it the Wanderers, but the old owner still held the name and wouldn't sell it for less than an obscene amount of money. So they renamed the team the Maroons. That becomes the English team. And so they resurrect that model of an English team and a French team. And of course, that has great benefits for a rivalry in the city. In the New York situation, the first team is the New York Americans, and they basically are tenants of Tex Rickard's Madison Square Garden. And Tex writes a really good deal where he basically gets this new team, the Americans, who are owned by a bootlegger named Bill Dwyer, to basically bankroll the installation of the artificial ice machinery in the arena. Tex was a brilliant negotiator because that cost, I think, $75,000. It was a lot of money in that time. And but as soon as the Americans So as soon as Tex Rickard sees how successful hockey is, he decides he wants his own team, and that becomes the Rangers. So at that point, the
the Rangers become the kind of the dominant tenant, and the Americans are kind of the unloved child of the garden. Back to Montreal. In Montreal, the Maroons start up in the Forum and with artificial ice, and the Canadiens think this is a really great idea. We're going to join them. So they actually play both in the Montreal Forum. So the Canadiens are independently owned, and the Forum are owned by the Maroons are owned by the Forum. By the 1930s, people are starting to realize that Montreal can't sustain that much elite level hockey, and so essentially covertly, it's not really public. The Forum buys the Canadiens. So they own both teams. And then 3 years later, in 1938, they decide we have to sacrifice one of the teams. And they look at the demographics of Montreal and say, well, there's more French Canadians than there are English Canadians. So they basically say, we're going to sacrifice the Maroons. Back to New York. In New York, Bill Dwyer was having trouble. Of course, after Prohibition got lifted, he wasn't making as much money. The IRS was going after him. He was constantly in financial trouble. And the league actually had to take over the Americans for a while. It seemed like a logical thing to keep the team going because MSG was such a big arena, it could make so much money. But basically, in the end, the Rangers ownership, MSG ownership, didn't want the team there. And so in 1942, when they run short of players, 1942-43, they basically say, we're going to suspend the team until after the war. And it basically never gets resurrected. And again, what you come back to is that there seems to be this realization that the model has to be ownership by one team owned by one arena is the way to go forward. And that's basically the reason that we don't have, as many people want, two teams in Toronto, right? Often people say there's examples where you have a very strong market like Toronto, and you could say we could have two teams playing in this one arena easily and still make lots of money.
I'm just surprised that before, it seems like 1942 is almost sort of a symbolic line of demarcation in the history of the league going forward. One of the eras, so to speak, arbitrary, I'm sure. But I'm surprised, frankly, that there wouldn't be a greater number by this time of other cities, right? So obviously, we're dancing around the Blackhawks of Chicago and the Detroit Red Wings and the Boston Bruins, right? So clearly in those cities and pretty stable, right, for a bunch of this period of time in the NHL's history. I'm just surprised that there wouldn't be a few other Eastern or Northeastern or Central Midwest or even other Canadian cities that couldn't sort of be in a position to step up and surface or create an arena as well. And it's pretty interesting, given all the competitiveness and minor league, I guess, the number of teams and stuff on the minor leagues, that there wouldn't be more than 6 or 7 NHL franchises during this period of time. And we're talking a good 20 or so years of growth and development. And the Great Depression, yes, World War II. I understand all those sort of macroeconomic issues, but I'm just surprised that by 42, we're still only looking at 7 teams, given the fervor and the interest of this sport, albeit even in the Northeastern region. I mean, I would imagine there are cities and places where there could have been more franchises.
Yeah, I think on the surface it seems like that. So what happens right after the war is Red Dutton, who's taken over from Frank Calder as the president for a brief period of time, and starts talking about expanding to Europe. Right? He basically, the lesson of the war was that we can get to Europe with a plane ride now, right? So maybe we should do that. You also have letters and people talking about expanding the NHL to California in 1945, 46. And then you see MSG itself talks about building a new arena at Columbus Circle, basically a massive new arena, and having a second team there. There was also an entrepreneur from Montreal who made a deal with the NHL to take over the Maroons franchise and move it to Philadelphia. Dutton himself, his goal was actually to resurrect the Brooklyn Americans in Brooklyn after the war. None of that happens in the late 40s. And like I said, I think the reason is essentially because of this crunch, especially on the American teams, of basically their attendance starts cratering because of TV. Not happening in Canada. In Canada, there's no other real city that's able to take that up that size. Ottawa is not interested. It's not as big, and the other one team would be Vancouver, and that's pretty far away. So, Montreal and Toronto are kind of the logical major leagues that can compete with an American size market. So the next team after that to really make a push is the Cleveland Barons, who were the champions of the AHL, had a very solid market, and were really gunning to be an NHL team. And they do, in the early 50s, apply for NHL franchise and get conditionally accepted. But a few months later, they get refused, and it's a big controversy. People at the time interpret it as the Norris family basically deciding we control 4 of the teams if we control 3 of the teams at that point. If we had an extra team, then we wouldn't have 50% of the votes at the table. There's conspiracy theories about that. But really what it came down to is they weren't sure about the financial security of the Cleveland owners. And you talked about Boston, Chicago being stable. In fact, in the early 50s, they were not stable. People were worried about whether or not they would survive. So the concern at the NHL's Board of Governors was that Cleveland had to have basically a rich person behind the ownership, or they were not going to survive very long. And so that's the big concern. So it's kind of a conservative point of view. In the 1920s, they really didn't care if people had money at all. They would just throw teams out there and see if they stuck. But by the 1950s, they're much more conservative.
I know this goes beyond the scope of the book, but I'm really curious to understand sort of, and maybe you're sowing some of the seeds of it. But why did the NHL stick with essentially just 6 franchises for so long, and arguably become interested in the idea of expansion so late relative to what was going on in other sports in the 50s and the 60s? Was it because of issues like this thing, or a fear? It seems that it took ironically, right? You're talking about a league that traces itself to some of the earliest days of professional sports in North America. Yet it was arguably, by maybe some estimations, years and decades, very late to the idea of expansion. The late 60s was, hard to believe when you look back at it in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, but that's, they had gone as far west as St. Louis, which turns out to be killer in terms of scheduling, and in the 30s, right? They'd gone to St. Louis, which is about as far west as baseball was. And what baseball only gets into the late 50s, only gets to California. So the NHL is basically 10 years behind baseball in terms of expanding. But you're right, there's this growing, the reason they were conservative, if you look at the league in the mid-60s, even though we talk about this golden age of the original 6, basically you had 3 super strong teams, which are Montreal, Toronto, 2 Canadian teams, and Detroit. And New York and Chicago and New York, Chicago, and Boston were essentially not necessarily doing very well at the box office, right? So the incentive to expand really isn't there yet. In the 60s, what they do see is they're basically everyone's recovering and they're maxing out their attendance, and they do realize we have to do something. And then the question is where? It's also arguably a defensive maneuver against the American Hockey League. This idea that if we don't do it, some other league will. And that's where the big California dream comes in, where they basically shoot themselves out over to California and try to tie that into another thing the NHL had really missed out on, which is national broadcasting of games. If you want to see the NHL be behind, it's in broadcasting. By that point, remember that the NFL in the 60s had really, under Rozelle, had really made a play for national broadcasting, and basically the modern NFL was built in the 60s. The NHL refused to do things like move its games to the afternoon to accommodate national TV schedules. It wasn't really interested in that kind of thing. It worried about the consequences of maybe people wouldn't show up to the games. This is a league where you might not know that Bill Wirtz, who ran the Chicago Blackhawks for many years and owned them, was even up to the 90s was restricting whether or not Chicago games could be broadcast in Chicago, right? He was so worried about attendance, right? The leagues like the NFL knew they had to expand and get big really quickly, so they took risks with broadcasting that the NHL wasn't taking, right? So that's where the broadcasting is really the area where the NHL falls back. There is this moment where you could see that Sunday football in the United States could have been hockey. It could have been Sunday hockey in the United States. That they had that moment where they could have made a push for that and been one of those Sunday sports, and they never did.
That's interesting. It also seems to be some evidence of, given 6 franchises and owners, right? Again, the tension between sort of centralized thinking about things such as national television versus independent or franchise-centric owners, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that it was still, a very small club, right? With and obviously we see sort of the seeds of how the WHA, has a path in the early 70s. Well, I think there's one other thing that we've kind of glossed over, and I know you do tackle this a bit in your book, and I think it's kind of maybe lost on a lot of sort of modern day sports fans, is that I think the NHL, also had a unique challenge and/or opportunity, maybe, in that they were a binational league, right, or a dual country kind of approach, right, versus say baseball, which was largely an American kind of pursuit, or American football. If there were any, most other sports seem to have some kind of separate sort of thing going on, but this was really the first sort of professional sport that kind of either had to or by design encompass 2 different countries simultaneously. I wonder how that either helped or hindered the growth of the NHL over the years, per our previous discussion.
Yeah, it is one of the central features. It probably wasn't the first league to have done this. There would have been minor league baseball leagues that we don't know as much about that were crossing borders even late into the late 19th century. But yeah, this binational feature is particularly important because it shows how unusual the sport is, or how the business organization is. The history of major league sports in North America, and very much dominated by baseball, is that baseball is given essentially this special place to run itself as a monopoly and control its players in a certain way that many other businesses are not allowed to do. And the other major leagues kind of free ride off baseball's model. It's like, well, we're major leagues like baseball. But in the war, you get this, the Second World War, you get this very interesting situation where the NHL has to keep crossing the border, and it's gone to war with Germany, and the United States hasn't. And the United States, of course, has this legislation that says you can't help out a country that's going to war with another country without us being at war as well. So then the border becomes much more important in terms of what's moving across it. Canada is very much interested in getting American dollars so it can buy material, buy war goods for its war, and it sees its players as being kind of an opportunity to get their salaries and bring them back to Canada, get their U.S. dollars and buy things. But what's interesting to me about the binational aspect in particular is how the league uses this as part of its argument for why they're special, and it becomes difficult for in particular the players to make progress collectively because they're dealing with these different jurisdictions, right? And so when they start, this is 1957, when they start out their own union, again, soon after baseball has done the same thing, they have a real problem essentially getting certified as a union because they have to deal with 6 different jurisdictions in 2 different countries, right? So they basically fail to create this NHLPA and have it sustained because the league essentially says, well, we have to go to each different state in each different province to make these arguments, right? So, it's a fascinating element about how baseball basically can deal with one jurisdiction and go to the president and get its green light letter in the Second World War to continue, and Canada has to negotiate with 2 governments who have different ideas about whether or not sport should continue during the war.
Before we wrap up, give me some sense of some of the personalities involved in. You mentioned Calder before, and obviously some of these names that are still etched into some of the trophies that are given out to some of the better players and owners and league officials every year, right? I think obviously people sort of forget where these names emanated from, but maybe a bit of a taste of some of the personalities involved that sort of kept and maybe solidified the central control, shall we say, of the NHL over the years that made those contributions to keep this league going in the 30s and 40s, and then thriving as Original Six and then beyond in the years that followed.
Yeah, sure. That's one of the things that I really was very much interested in, is the interpersonal relationships of the owners and where they came from. And to some extent, what's interesting to me is that, when you look at the census page of Westmount, Quebec, and I think 1901 I looked at it, you notice that Lester Patrick and his brother Frank, who are living on the same street as Art Ross, the legendary player and later part owner of the Boston Bruins. And the Patricks, of course, were stars in the pre-NHL leagues. Lester Patrick was the longtime coach and vice president of Madison Square Garden. His brother and he had started out the PCHA. So it's fascinating to me that there's kind of this one street in Westmount that produced all these hockey players and entrepreneurs. But there, when you look at the Board of Governors meetings, we have some of the minutes of those. It doesn't really show you always how they behave towards each other. You see some of their arguments and how some people were better at the table than others. But there are legendary stories of fist fights at either during or after the meetings, where someone would clock someone in the face. And I thought, that's not your usual board of directors meeting in a regular corporation going on there, right? So and this is often related to, relationships that these owners or managers had on the ice, the decade before. So there's grudges. Art Ross and Conn Smythe, had a legendary grudge against each other, where they would, I don't know if they'd physically attack each other, but they would prank each other and such. What's also interesting is that throughout the theme of the NHL, you have this one kind of owner who's kind of an upright businessman, leader of the community, but they also at some points have let people in who are not so upright. And I mentioned Bill Dwyer, who's a bootlegger. Often in the urge to get a team expanded into a market that maybe wasn't so sure, the NHL has not been too clear about the kind of business the person has been in when they get the team, right? And we've seen this on occasion where sometimes years after a team has been established, you realize that, charges have been laid against the owner for some various maybe financial issues or things like that, that they've taken people into the club, so to speak, of the NHL, who are looking themselves to legitimize their behavior, right? That owning a sports team is actually a way of washing your reputation in the community, right? And so that's attractive to a certain kind of businessman, not only the morally upright one, but the person who wants to be seen as morally upright. So there's lots of characters that come out of that. One day there was a great story of Frank Calder showing up to a meeting and telling someone that it was someone coming to a meeting and saying that he'd walk down the street with Bill Dwyer, and Calder said, you shouldn't walk on the street with that man. One day he came into a meeting and he opened his coat and a bullet fell out. Right? So there was some quite interesting stories of these guys, especially in the 20s and the 30s.
That's really, so I guess the one last sort of question I'll ask is, as the Original Six, kind of became, somewhat dominant and solidified, post-war, and became basically, what the NHL was about, and a lot of interesting stories and players. You even had the beginnings of a Hockey Night in Canada, right, which arguably was sort of the beginnings of what at least some idea of a national television sort of exposure for the league, right? Not necessarily in the United States, but gives an idea of maybe how television revenues could bring into play. What I want to understand is during that era, right, that post-war era, and that to an extent flourishing, right? When and how does that? I guess what I'm getting at is why not? I'm surprised that more challenge didn't come to this league from either outside sources or internally to expand, right? I mean, there's sort of that nickname, I guess they call it the sort of, by the 60s, it was sort of known as the Norris House League, right? As the moniker, right? And it just seems that the tighter the grip around this league, the more, I don't know, out of step with the times it would seem, given the opportunities that, say, television and or potentially other markets might have been beckoning. And again, we talked about it before, but I'm wondering how that centralized thing was either good or bad for the NHL, given that it was still only 6 teams and relatively regional, by this period of time.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to the early 60s. You see a big transition in the actual owners themselves. So Conn Smythe essentially gives the team to his son. There's a transition in Boston. Old man Norris, Jim Norris, had been dead by this point. The ownership had changed in Detroit and Chicago. And the early 60s is a moment where David Molson, actually one of the new owners of the Montreal Canadiens, basically is one of the people who puts forward the expansion plan. So you see basically new blood at the Board of Governors table who are younger men who do see the opportunities. They are probably a little bit more financially inclined. They see that there's money to be made to do this, and they do start seeing that they're less conservative, right? They haven't gone through they don't have the memory of the 30s where keeping a team and keeping a team financially solid is the most important thing. Now they're willing to take more risks. So I think that's probably what really explains that. And the league had benefited from the stability, but it saw the horizon was going to have other rival leagues. And in fact, their 1967 and 70 expansion don't actually thwart the WHA, right? So even though they do expand, there's this pent up demand that the WHA takes advantage of in the 70s to make it happen anyway, right? So they did pay the price in that sense for delaying in a way that, say, baseball didn't, where you don't see as much failed expansion in baseball, certainly as you do in hockey, if you take into account the WHA. But I think that's what was really going on as an institutional, there's only 6 people at the table, and if they all have memories if they all agree, it's hard to break through that. Whereas maybe a bigger league like now, you've got 30, 32, pushing 32. That's a lot of different voices at the table that can push things in different directions. And now I'd say the league is much more, financially inclined, right? They're much bolder in terms of expansion.
Well, yeah, and I think, and this will sort of be my sort of last question, but I think it's really, we've seen this theme over and over again, right? Where it's sort of this old boys club, if you will, Lamar Hunt, the AFL, right? Kind of a shot across the bow to the NFL. I mean, a lot of it starts with rejection from the club, meaning, you want to get in and you can't figure out a way. I mean, Donald Trump with the USFL, right? New Jersey Generals, Steve Ross with the New York Cosmos, right? Soccer team. He ostensibly started because he couldn't immediately get an NFL franchise, right? So there's that's sort of, when you can't, but I guess it's nice to be wanted. And I got to think that the NHL ownership at the time sort of recognized, hey, we've got something good here. We're not just going to let any interloper into it. But I guess there's probably no better person to ask this sort of final question about is, how do you juxtapose some of these earliest years and the original 6 and the solidification and, all that stuff that we've kind of talked about, how the NHL kind of created its foundation with the, I don't know, in some cases, seemingly curious state of the NHL today, right? Obviously, the Golden Knights of Las Vegas, right? A phenomenon I don't think many people actually saw coming. You've got Seattle, right? That looks like it's circling around a $500 million price tag to get its own expansion franchise. Yet you've got a number of teams that are in some of these regions of the United States, for example, like in Arizona or in Florida, that are you could argue Carolina. They're a little wobbly, shall we say, or not necessarily well rooted. I guess I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about sort of the state of the economics and the sport of pro hockey, the NHL variety, relative to the roots, right? I mean, obviously, a lot of it's big money, of course. A lot of it's television, sure. But, I mean, do you think it's sustainable at 30, 32 teams? Do you think it is a national sport or fully embraced as an ongoing? And maybe more interestingly, can it survive an economic downturn if and when it occurs, which is, cyclically inevitable, I guess?
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. I mean, often when I'm talking about the early history of the league to people, I like to point out that in some sense, the strategy hasn't changed in 100 years, which is essentially the league expands usually because it has to, not because it wants to. Either an individual owner or team is powerful and it says we must keep that in or else we're going to have problems with a rival, or we're going to have to, and this is often meant moving south. So people often talk about Gary Bettman's Southern strategy. Well, the Southern strategy was first talked about essentially in the 1912 or 13 as people talked about going to Boston because they saw there's an opportunity for us, but also this fear that if they didn't take the opportunity, there would be a rival league, right? And then they would take their players, right? So it is actually a long-standing, consistent strategy to move into new spaces. And I guess with the NHL and leagues like it to be successful, they always have to be comfortable with failure. They have to be comfortable that it's not always going to work out. And the NHL seems comfortable with that. They seem comfortable with moving teams around when they have to. What they are wedded to, and this comes back to our earlier part of our conversation, is they are still wedded to this notion of the individual owner in the cartel. And that's the real question that maybe they might have to ask down the road, is whether or not it's actually more efficient to have this centrally owned. The reason that people wanted individual teams 100 years ago was because they worried about the integrity of the game on the ice. Do we worry about that anymore? They also worry that, or part of the marketing model is having the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Chicago Blackhawks. Is that as important anymore as we have people that love the Blackhawks who live in Nova Scotia or live in California, right? And so would customers accept that the league be owned in a different way and still come into the arenas? Because I think that's where probably the big efficiencies and the ability of the league to sustain itself if faced with a downturn would come, is if they've got that flexibility to mix and match in terms of ownership. I mean, it's happened, you see, in the CFL, Canadian Football League here in Canada, where they've had a weak team and essentially allowed an owner to own two teams, right? They essentially did it. The NHL did that in the 30s, where it essentially allowed Norris's money to get into different arenas and different teams just for the sake of survival, right? So that's what they would have to they'd have to look to, I think, if they really got pushed economically, is they'd have to look to some major rationalization, maybe not as far as the Bain Capital proposal, but something that will allow them to soften the blow if there's kind of a economic downturn and more widely in sport.
Well, this has been fascinating. I mean, again, I subscribe very much to the theory of those who ignore history, are saddled or doomed to repeat it. And again, there are themes that you've mentioned that go back, decades and almost centuries now, a century that they continue to exhibit themselves. And we didn't even talk about sort of labor issues and owners versus players and all that. And obviously there's the NHL and this famous lockouts and all this kind of stuff. But these issues don't seem to sort of go away. They just sort of seem to morph and nuance, but they keep coming back, and it's very interesting that as we go back into some of the reasons why teams and leagues don't exist anymore, or where they've morphed or changed. Some of the foundational reasons are rooted in economics, and some of those economic issues are simply cyclical, not necessarily brand new. Although I think every generation thinks that these issues are unique to them, right?
Of course.
All right, so give
I definitely agree.
Yeah, here's your chance to give us some promotional goodness for the book, and I also want to know if you're working on any other things in and around related to pro sports or any other things you got going on research wise. Sure.
Yeah. So the book, Joining the Clubs, the Business of the National Hockey League to 1945, was essentially the first half of my PhD dissertation on the history of the NHL. So there, in fact, is a second manuscript in the works, which is essentially 1946 to 1967 to up to the first, not the first expansion, but the doubling of league in 1967. So I have to make some decisions about whether or not that manuscript is going to include any material afterwards, namely into the WHA era. I think if not, it will come out sooner rather than later. If it requires a little bit more research, then it might be delayed a little bit. But that is essentially part two of this. Will take us up to at least 1967. So probably a couple of years to get that ground out. But I'm looking forward to that.
Well, that's great. So this little show has strangely reached into various nooks and crannies of sports fandom, and our pursuits of hockey thus far have been among the most sought after and or passion filled, shall we say, in terms of response from the audience. And I think if you're looking for some level of support and or encouragement, right, to not only do that second perhaps chapter, but maybe even that third, inclusive of the WHA and beyond. You're probably going to find it in our little tribe of listeners so far. So I hope all of you out there not only buy Andrew's book of now, but we'll encourage him to get his future writings out there as well, because you have found some kindred souls here for whatever reason in this audience, Andrew. So I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to staying in touch, but also wanted to hear when you sort of get some detail around when maybe your next work comes out or is close to it. This is very much in our wheelhouse, and we appreciate your taking time to be part of it.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Tim.
Well, all right, there it is. Don't mean to leave you hanging there, hockey fans, but obviously a lot happened to the sport and the NHL in particular after 1945 when Andrew Ross's book kind of leaves off. But as you heard him say, he's already well into his sort of next chapter, shall we say, of the story. And some very interesting things yet to come, as you hockey historians may know. In the years that followed 1945, all the way up to and inclusive of the great expansion of 1967, and leaving us at the doorstep of the WHA, which came a few years after that. The book, though, for now, that I encourage you to read, to find, to devour, as I have, is called Joining the Clubs, The Business of the National Hockey League to 1945 by our guest, J. Andrew Ross. That's his official name and title. It is published by Syracuse University Press. It is available wherever good books are found. And of course, you can find a link to that book and get give a little love to our show by clicking on that link and buying that book through Amazon on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up the episode with Andrew Ross talking about the early days of the NHL, and you will find not only a show description, but you will find a link to that book from our website. We appreciate you doing that. And while you're there, might you also fancy a like or a follow on our various social media feeds? At Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You can like us on Facebook. You can also send us email either from the site or just directly, and that's hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Send us an email there as well. We appreciate that. And all the old episodes are there for you to find and download and listen to or stream, whatever you want to do. And last but not least, I want to say a hearty thanks to our friend Jerry Payne and his pals at Podfly Productions for helping us produce this fine little podcast each and every week. You can find out more about him and Podfly Productions at their website, and that's podfly.net. All right, thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you again sometime next week with another fun-filled episode. Until then, hang in there, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.